Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Chartered Accountants Ulster Society webinar. The title of our session today is Taming the Zedonk, Horrible Hybrids and the Future of Work. And if anyone in attendance today doesn't know what a Zedonk is, I'm sure you'll find out this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason McIntosh, and I am the convener of the Chartered Accountants and Business Subcommittee of the Ulster Society. The subcommittee aims to ensure that the Society remains relevant for and supportive to Chartered Accountants working in business. We aim to do this through a calendar of relevant events and content for our members, both informative and networking in nature, although often our events are relevant for wider society members as well. Recently, we've been providing a combination of online and face-to-face events, something we intend to continue to do going forward. Our most recent online webinar style events were a skills and apprenticeship webinar in October, and in partnership with the Member Services and Public Sector subcommittees, a webinar titled The Sustainability Journey, Responsibilities, Strategy and Reporting. As with all webinar content provided by the various subcommittees of the Ulster Society, you can find the recordings of these webinars on the Ulster Society website. After the event today, you will receive a request for feedback, and I would very much welcome the opportunity to hear feedback, both on today's event and also on our calendar of events more generally, either by filling out that feedback request or by getting in touch with me directly. So without further ado, let's move on to the content of today's webinar. It's great to see we have over 200 people registered today, which I think shows the huge interest both in the topic that we're discussing today and also our wonderful speaker. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Nicola Millard. Those of you who are regular attendees at our webinars will no doubt remember the very interesting presentation by Nicola during the Reshaping How We Work webinar in January 2021, which terrifyingly is almost exactly 2 years ago now. And I've no doubt you're all eagerly anticipating the follow-up today. Before I hand over, I'd just like to give a brief introduction to our speaker. So, I've seen this in the content that was shared. So, once described as human caffeine on Twitter, Dr. Nicola Millard injects a positive, people-centered espresso shot to innovation and future strategy. Half social scientist, half technologist, all academic, she uses techniques from disciplines such as design thinking, psychology, anthropology, computing, and business consulting to generate data, provocations, and stories which can engage and create conversations from the boardroom to the front line. So today we're going to hear about some of the key issues shaping the hybrid world of work, such as building resilience in the new way of working, how the world of work has changed and the trends that employers and employees are finding, the challenge of managing teams remotely, key management and tech considerations, what is an office for? Good question. Meetings culture, are meetings the best use of time? Will the metaverse actually be useful to the world of work? And to make our session as interactive as possible, I really would encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom during the presentation. And finally, I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be made available to members later. So with that, I'm going to stop speaking and hand over to Nicola for today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that kind introduction. So, hello. Some of you will have seen my previous presentation, I hope anyway, and hopefully you'll see some degree of progress. Indeed, although, I mean, 2 years ago, I was very obviously standing in my front room with my slippers on, because we all were. And oddly enough, I'm standing in my room with my slippers on today as well. So I'm getting out a little bit more than I was previously. Actually, I was in Belfast last week, had a really interesting couple of days doing a lot of the same, talking about the future of work. So for those of you who don't know me, hello, my name's Nicola. I did used to be BT's futurologist, which is, yes, a very silly job title, and always comes with the same question, which obviously I can feel coming through the ether, which is, do you have a crystal ball? The answer to that is yes, I do. Someone very kindly gave me one. I saw no future in it though. So my job title's got a lot more boring. My job most definitely have not. So I'm part of BT's innovation team. You might not know that BT does innovation, because that's one thing that certainly my job is about, raising the profile of the innovation and research that we do. I think we're about the 5th biggest investor in the UK around research and innovation at the moment. We're behind a few of the pharmaceutical companies for obvious reasons, but we filed last year actually the highest number of patents in the Europe, I think, for AI. So, you know, we're kind of more than just a telecoms company, let's put it that way. So I'm actually based at Adastral Park, which is our main research and innovation facility. It's about 7 miles from where I'm standing at the moment. So I'm in Ipswich. It's about 7 miles outside Ipswich in a wonderful place called Martlesham Heath, which was actually a really historic site. It was where the Royal Air Force did their research and innovation. So they crashed planes. We now crash technologies there. To be honest, the reason I don't need a crystal ball is largely because we've got an incredible resource there. You've got people that are, obsessed about things like quantum computing and AI, and probably know more than anyone else that you'll know anyway. Certainly I know about those topics. Sometimes maybe a little bit quantum especially blows my mind. It is quantum, baby, but so I get to talk to a lot of those guys. I also work with an extensive network of university partners to do my job. I am a slightly weird part of the innovation team. And I'm half a technologist. You expect lots of technology innovation going on in BT, and I'm interested in technology. I have a background in things like AI, but actually my first discipline is psychology. So I claim I look at the most disruptive part of innovation, which is of course not the technology, it's us, because unless we use it and embrace it, it's pretty pointless, to be perfectly honest. So a lot of what I do, I do the thought leadership bit of the team. We then try and test out that thought leadership. I work extensively and innovate with and for primarily our enterprise and global business clients. So I work with all sorts of sectors. In fact, just yesterday, I was with an insurance company in the morning and police in the afternoon. And oddly enough, a lot of them have the same issues. There are some little, differences between public and private sector for sure, but we're all wrestling with the same thing. And a lot of that comes down to the Zedonk, and I will explain what a Zedonk is in a minute. We've been running research around the future of work for about 14 years now, so way before the pandemic. It was interesting. I mean, the pandemic has been absolutely fascinating because it accelerated a lot of the trends that we've been talking about. They came through overnight, and now we're orienting to the future again, to say, okay, what have we learned? What's going to stick? What are we struggling with? What are our challenges at the moment in terms of reinventing that future world of work? And it's quite interesting. It's January at the moment, so there's a lot of predictions flying around as to what 2023 might have in store for us. I always collect things like that. So if I can get my slides to change. Oh, there we go. So yeah, there were some very interesting predictions from the past published in the first week of January, and this one caught my eye. This was actually from a scientist and engineer, Charles Steinmetz, who in 1923 was trying to predict 100 years into the future. Now, as a former futurologist, I can tell you that's almost impossible to do. And I thought this was quite interesting because initially you read it and you go, yeah, well, that's never going to come true. But I think we've got a lot of questions that actually this prediction kind of raises. And a lot of these we're sort of looking at in terms of that future world of work. The first thing is 4 hours a day might sound a bit weird. But given that the majority of us who benefited from hybrid working and home working are knowledge workers, cognitive work is quite an interesting one on this one. Now, our brains are not built to work 8 hours a day, particularly on concentrated and complex tasks. In fact, the cognitive scientists have worked out that largely on complex tasks, our brains are efficient for 4 hours a day. So that's an intriguing prospect for a start. So when we're doing complex stuff, probably we shouldn't do much more than 4 hours a day. So that's one thing to think about here. Of course, the other debate that's going on, and there has been a UK-wide trial of the 4-day week. Not quite the same thing, but that was very successful. 70% of the companies that chose to do it have decided to continue doing it. They're just publishing some of the results now, so it's kind of a watch this space on the detail there. But there are lots of debates around how do we disrupt that world of work. Interestingly enough, even the 5-day week is a relatively modern invention. It came out of the Industrial Revolution and was about efficiency. Previously it was 6 or 7 day a week. Could we, if we reduce the number of hours, actually make people work much more productively because they don't burn out? Then of course we get tired. So you might write this one off and go, well, that's nonsense. I think actually there might be a little bit more in it than that. And I think this is all about how do we think very differently about work. I mean, I think in the hybrid world, a lot of the discussion at the moment amongst companies, including BT, to be honest, is, well, how many days should I be in our office then? Or, how many days should I be at home? And this is data we're about to publish, that we did some research with global business leaders and strategists, asking them, ideally, how many hours would you like to work at home versus the office in a week? You can firstly see that there are some very big cultural differences here. We can see that the US tends to be a slightly more office-based culture compared to Europe and Asia. You can also see actually from this data that the two extremes are a minority. So 5 days in the office, a minority, 5 days at home, a minority. It's actually something in between. And that something in between has been ebbing and flowing. And actually, if you looked at the UK specific data 6 months ago, the preference was 2 days in the office, 3 days at home. That's flipped now into a 3-2, and that's starting to almost become the standard of hybrid working across many organizations. So three days in the office, 2 days at home. This, however, is not the debate we should be having, in my opinion, anyway. I think we get way too hung up on, how many days and how many hours. The fundamental question we should be asking is, how does work? And how do we get work to work better? For 3 reasons. We need it to work better for people. We need to make it work better for productivity, which has been stagnant for years. And we need, during a global climate crisis, to make it better for the planet. And I think that's the interesting concept here, not the number of days a week. To be honest, I use the analogy of the Zedonk because the Zedonk is my favorite hybrid in the world. It's a combination of zebra and donkey. It looks a little bit like a donkey with zebra socks, to be perfectly honest. It's very cute. Google it. But it doesn't wake up every morning going, hang on, am I a zebra or am I a donkey now? Any more than we should wake up every morning and go, am I an office worker today or am I a home worker? Because it should be the work that dictates where I work and when I work. And that's the important thing. So I think as we're trying to do this reinvention, we need to bear in mind that the Industrial Revolution changed work. The digital revolution has been changing work. And obviously, a crisis came in the middle and accelerated a lot of that stuff. So homeworking had been around for a long time. Our first trials were back in 1992. That was one of my first projects in BT, actually, our first homeworking trial. The trouble then was we did not have what I call the holy trinity of technologies. So cloud services, collaboration tools and connectivity. Back in 92, we literally had to dig people's front gardens up in order to get a big enough pipe into their house to help them to work. Now, I suspect it cost us £11,000 a seat then. If a pandemic had happened in 1992, I think we would have struggled. But I would also comment that holy trinity of technologies had been around for a while. They just hadn't necessarily changed work in the way that a crisis did. So I think, as Linda Grattan quite rightly says, and Linda's a fantastic thinker around the future world of work, if you've not come across her. I'm not her agent, by the way, but she's got some great books out there. But she absolutely says what we shouldn't do is take the analog world, and particularly the horrible bits of the analog world, and take them into the digital world. Actually, hybrid potentially is a new way of working, just as the Zedonk is an entirely new breed. So we need to think about the work. And I think that's the interesting thing strategically around, well, what are the drivers and a lot of the thinking here? Again, this is from our global research. There are some obvious ones. Recruitment and retention, big one at the moment. We have a skills shortage. So recruiting and retaining employees has become very important to businesses. So in fact, if you look at them, if you ask employees what their number one thing that they're looking for in a job, it's generally predictability, flexibility, autonomy, trust. All of those things actually were benefited during the pandemic. And if we reset to prior to the pandemic, we didn't have that level of flexibility. So in fact, we're seeing, LinkedIn have said that if you actually put flexible or hybrid working in a job advert, 40% more applicants go for that job. The second one is obviously around carbon, the green agenda and sustainability. So that's why I said we need to start to look at, is this the most sustainable way of working from a carbon perspective as well as an energy perspective? The third one is office transformation. I think most companies are starting to rethink their offices. Some are downsizing. Some are certainly doing a lot of refurbing. That's what we've done in BT. We have some brand new buildings which look very different to our old ones. For a start, they have windows, because I used to joke that you could always spot a BT building. They were the ones without windows, because frankly our buildings were built for technology, not for people. And the buildings we have, the new ones we have, are all windows basically, so a big transformation there. But the question was asked at the very beginning, what are offices for? And I think that's a big question for hybrid organizations, so I'll go into that in a minute. Then there's a lot about culture and well-being. I'm going to talk a lot about that because that's very much in my wheelhouse as a psychologist, but the challenge of actually managing employees who are very diverse, where one size doesn't fit all, and where culture is a challenge in terms of building a solid culture when you're not necessarily co-located. Then a lot about collaboration, again, very much in our wheelhouse in BT. How do we actually get collaboration to work? How do we understand collaboration in a hybrid world? And then finally, the one I'm not going to talk about, some of you may be relieved, but is security. I'm not a security expert. I will say that a lot of things that have been holding a lot of organizations back, particularly in things like financial services, has been around making sure that the data is secure and that employees are secure. There are lots of things you can do for that. I'm not the security expert. If you want a conversation about that, I can introduce you to people who can really bore for Britain really on security. So I'm not going to cover security in this session. I'd say we've learned a lot around hybrid. Hybrid always was a model that's been around for a very long time. A lot of global companies have been doing it for years, because you have to. If you're global, you're not co-located, so you have to juggle with time and space. I think we're now getting a lot, because it's now at scale, we're getting a lot of data across all industries around how difficult this is to actually get right. And I would say the first comment is actually my last bullet points. No one has the right answers here. A lot of us are learning by experimentation and just trying stuff. And some of it's not working. Some of it is. That does not mean that you go, okay, let's just reset it back to 5 days in the office. I think from a psychology perspective, the interesting stuff is around proximity biases, which are unconscious biases. Our brains are brilliant, but they are somewhat primitively wired. So I keep saying, you know, our Neanderthal cells grew up in caves, and we had communities that we could see, and we built trust by seeing people on a very regular basis. And of course, in a hybrid model, that breaks. So we know from before the pandemic, there were worries around, well, if I'm not seen to be in the office, am I going to get promoted? Am I going to get a good appraisal? And I think those questions are still in people's minds, even though a lot of cultures have shifted slightly. I do think proximity biases, I mean, the obvious proximity biases in meetings, and I'm sure we've all had those horrible hybrid meetings, I call them, you know, when half the people are in the room and half the people are coming in digitally. I had one last week where I was in the room and we literally forgot about the people online until it was a 4-hour meeting. They were on for 4 hours. We remembered they were there for the last 2 minutes. And we suddenly went onto the digital platform and we saw lots of chats and we saw lots of questions, and we've seen none of those during the session, because what had happened was that proximity bias had meant the room only talked to the room. And because most people in the room was not on the digital platform, they couldn't see the chat, they didn't see the hands raised, and I think that's a very big thing that we need to really get our heads around. More on that in a minute, because I'm going to talk about meetings a lot today because it's an obsession of mine. I think the other problem that we have is we tend to be a bit addicted to synchrony. In other words, we tend to have lots and lots of meetings rather than maybe moving some of that onto asynchrony. And again, this is about lifting, you know, and shifting analog into the digital age rather than just saying analog into analog digital. We've got lots of asynchronous tools out there, ranging from email, chat, shared, you know, spaces, all of those kind of things we can actually start to do more asynchronously. In fact, MIT did some beautiful research earlier on this year showing that brainstorming, which everyone's going, oh, it's much better in a room. If you split it between asynchronous and synchronous, in other words, do the actual thinking asynchronously, put all your thoughts down, actually the quality and quantity of ideas generated in asynchronous brainstorms were far better than in fully synchronous ones. but then you come together synchronously to actually talk about those ideas and prioritize them. So that's just shifting how we do some of that traditional stuff. Then, of course, there's all sorts of things around time, because hybrid can be place, but also it can be time. I think we need to think about that, particularly for people. 50% of people could work from home because they were knowledge workers. 50% of people could not because they were frontline workers. So if you can't give a choice on place, can you give a choice on time? And that could be anything from shift bartering to simply choosing the number of days that you were in. Now, that can be a problem as well, because of course you get all sorts of different day patterns that you then need to coordinate. The 3-2 seems to have settled down to Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays typically. I won't abbreviate that, but because it's slightly rude, but that's the typical pattern. But we do have other patterns. We've got the potatoes, probably on Tuesdays and Thursdays only. We've got Wednesdays plus oneers. You can start to see that there's all sorts of things going on here, and that's why it's important to get coordination right. We also get over and under capacity of offices in this model, because typically the least popular days are Monday and to a greater extent Friday. Friday is tumbleweed in most offices. And I'm getting a lot of questions actually now because of an energy crisis as well. Cost of energy. If you've got an office that's empty on a Friday, should you just close that office? Should you have hotspots within that office, just rooms that you heat and don't heat the rest of the office? We're having these discussions now because there is a different pattern emerging. Then, of course, there's a lot around buzz and communities of coping. I've done a lot with contact centers actually over the years, and we did a deeper dive on their experience of the pandemic. And of course, contact centers at the moment are having to take some quite complex and very emotive calls. When you can see people crying, when you can see stress, or you can swivel your chair around and yell, does anyone know about that's easy. It's not so easy when you're at home. So I think we need to look at, how do we create digital communities of coping here? If you're having a bad day, yes, we can put digital platforms in to do that. But actually the culture needs to be there to admit that you're stressed. And given I'm working with the police at the moment, that's a very, very pertinent one, because that culture, they do not admit that they are stressed. And that's bad news, basically. And then, to be honest, a lot of this boils down to leadership, as it always does. And I think leaders actually had a bit of a trial by fire during lockdowns. We interviewed contact center managers actually towards the middle of lockdown, and then again a year later, just to see how their attitudes had changed. And initially they were kind of, we want everyone back because we don't know how to manage a remote team. And then they learned how to manage a remote team really well. And now they're really anxious about hybrid working around that split, that proximity bias, whether they are, unconsciously benefiting certain employees and disbenefiting others. A lot of this is about skill. And I keep saying one of the key skills for the future is networking. I always say we all need to be perfect party hosts here. So a perfect party host knows when to throw a party. There's a purpose to the party. They invite specific people because they'll be great at a party. And then they're very good at knowing a little bit about all of them and introducing them and creating a purpose for conversation. That's the perfect leader. There's good and bad news on that one. The bad news is most of us are good at, exceptionally bad actually at networking. I'm a terrible networker. So it's not necessarily a skill that we all have, but it is a skill. So we can train it. And I think I'm starting to see in a lot of particularly apprentice and sort of leadership training programs, networking becoming part of that course. As I said, no one has the answers here. I certainly don't. I've got a lot of research, but I don't have all the answers. And we're not necessarily seeing any one person doing it right either. I do want to delve down on one thing, because I think those 4-day week trials, one of the big things that came out was, in order to do 100% of the work in 80% of the time with 100% of the pay, the first thing that came under discussion was meetings, because you can't do it if you're going to have the level of meetings that we currently have. Now, I don't know about you, but certainly during lockdown, I used to wake up with an impending sense of Zoom. To be perfectly honest, I have today just had back-to-back online meetings. They're not necessarily productive. Meetings are a massive time vampire. And I think, as I said, we're addicted to synchrony. Hey, we're going to look productive if we have lots of meetings. So we end up talking about the work rather than necessarily doing it. And again, Microsoft did some absolutely fantastic research where they wired people's brains up and basically put them through death by meeting days. And you could see by mid-afternoon, the brain started to turn to some kind of sponge cake. We can probably all relate to that. Mine is starting now to turn to sponge cake, to be perfectly honest. So I'm amazed I'm making any sense whatsoever. But it's not a productive way of working. So I think the first thing we need to ask is, should this be a meeting? Could we do this asynchronously better than synchronously? When we do come together synchronously, it should matter. It should be about things that we are good at doing synchronously, emotive stuff, complex stuff, key decision making, building relationships, all should be done synchronously. And then should they be done all in a room? Well, it's certainly much easier if everyone is in the room. We don't have the horrible hybrid. But I think 95%, I saw a stat saying 95% of meetings now, at least one person is coming in virtually. And as soon as you've got one person coming in virtually, you've got a whole different level of complexity. Some of it's about moderation. As I said, there's a risk the meeting could break into two. Some of it's about the technology. I think the ways that meeting rooms typically are set up is there's usually a camera at one end and you get a tapering view of a table if you're coming in digitally, and little ant-like people around that table that you can't really see. And in a worst case scenario, you also can't hear them. So, I mean, obviously the basics around being able to see them. So having multiple cameras that zoom into people that speak, microphones around the room, all of that's kind of, starting to become a lot more common. We're also looking at some more novel solutions for that, but more on that towards the end around bringing in maybe the metaverse on some of this stuff. But ultimately it is all around, well, maybe we should talk about meetings a bit more and think about them and think whether this should be a meeting or a message. Of course, offices do have a place in this model. They're not dead. In fact, I think they're probably more important than they've ever been before. It's just we're not in them as much. So, I mean, there is this big question around, well, what are they for? And certainly the research, even before the pandemic, was pointing towards that they are key places for communication, collaboration, and creation of community. But not everyone coped with working from home. Aside from those 50% that had to be in an office because they were in a frontline role, the 50% of us that were lucky enough to do it had some very positive things going on. So I think most people did welcome at least a couple of days at home. Certainly there's a lot of things around commute. There's a bit of a tension at the moment, I think, particularly amongst senior leaders around the value of the office. And it's interesting that managers think that employees are less productive when they're working from home, whereas employees think they're more productive. And actually, Nick Bloom, who's doing some beautiful research over in Stanford on this, said that the key factor is the commute. Managers tend to ignore the commute. Employees find it incredibly painful and factor that into their productivity. So that's a really interesting tension that we're seeing from the data. But it didn't work for everybody. Worked for about 70% of the people that could do it, did not work for 30%. A lot of that 30% skews younger. There are reasons for that. Younger people typically do live in shared houses, so they're competing for space, they're competing for bandwidth. They don't necessarily have the social network, the work social network that maybe some of us that have been in offices for a long time have. And that's valuable. And actually, when you ask younger employees about the office, they value it a lot more than other generations. But they also simultaneously value not being in it. So they value that flexibility. So, I mean, if you look at the graphs, this is again from the global research, there are things that are kind of actually both advantages in both models and disadvantages in both models. The key message is one size does not fit all here. It's down to the individual, the team dynamic, what the work is, as to where maybe we need to do that work. Of course, I've talked a lot about home working and office working. There is a third space as well. In fact, a lot of this conversation has started to emerge from the fact that hybrid is not necessarily the most carbon neutral way of working. Because if we think about it, we're heating, lighting, cooling offices, we're heating, lighting, cooling houses, and we have some commute. So the first thing is making offices more carbon neutral. Lots of people are doing that. So that's good. Maybe we could also look at home energy usage becoming more carbon neutral. There's a couple of customers I'm working with, at least prior to the energy crisis, where incentivizing employees to adopt much more greener energy options. And then, of course, the commute is a big one. And I think people that want to get out of the house but don't want maybe a 2-hour commute into an urban location are starting to look at those third spaces that are emerging. I call them coffices. They're also known as co-working spaces. So they're a walk or a cycle ride away. You get out of the house, but you're not in a centralized commuting urban office. I know down in the Republic of Ireland, they published a rural working manifesto that caught my eye ages ago. It was about 2 years ago, I think now, looking at the potential of community pubs, for example, as workplaces, or poffices, as I would like to call them. I think that's a beautiful idea, because actually pubs are often very underutilized during the day and actually could be very communal. I'm not sure I'd be that productive if beer was involved, though. So yeah, I think we need to think about, again, one size doesn't mix all. I said my brain was turning to mush. One size does not fit all. And we need to look at different options for different teams and different individuals. But again, that's a real pain to coordinate. Then there was one that really did emerge. I mean, it emerged prior to the pandemic, but emerged during the pandemic, particularly when people were working from home, because the boundaries between work and home did completely disappear. Lots of people said they felt as if they were living at work. But that had begun before the pandemic. And even if you are not in an office, you are in an office, at least in a digital form, via the devices that connect you back. And the problem then is, how do we disconnect? There's a lot of research that we've done, both with Cambridge University. The stuff you can see here is with Lancaster University, looking at some of the problems we call techno stress, so particularly the technology, and something I call digital presenteeism. So the fact that if I'm not in an office, I might feel the need to be always on. We did a lot with Cambridge on this one. We developed a diet with Cambridge, which we were going to call the Cambridge diet, but someone got there before us. Sadly, we now have to call it the balanced communication diet for business, which doesn't trip off the tongue quite as well. But when we started to look at, what were the pressures of always on, it tended to be, for those that were stressed, the M&Ms: meetings, managers, and messages. And you can do something about all of those. And that's what the diet tries to do. Identify, and I've talked about meetings. Should it be a meeting? Should I be at every meeting? About the only thing I agree with Elon Musk on is his manifesto on meetings. The meeting has to have a purpose. I need a purpose to be at it. And if I feel I don't have a purpose to be at it, leave it. I think that's about the only thing I agree with him on. So meetings, managers have to be managed as well, in terms of expectations of when you're on and when you're off on holiday, and saying, well, I am on holiday, I am off at this point, I need some rest. And then messages, that's an interesting one, because sometimes asynchronous can start to be a problem as much as synchronous. So again, we probably need to think about, should this message also be a message? Should I disturb people? Should I CC everyone in the universe? Which makes you very popular, I can tell you, but it's all about fear of missing out. Then, I have to talk a little bit about the metaverse. It's a whole session in itself, the metaverse, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Sufficient to say that the metaverse, in its kind of science fiction sense, as in The Matrix or Ready Player One, doesn't exist, might never exist, certainly won't exist for a while. And what do we want to do in the metaverse is a very big debate. I'm not going to talk about the metaverse, really. I'm going to talk about the baby steps towards it. And obviously the baby steps towards it tend to be involved with things like virtual reality, augmented reality, and indeed mixed reality. So virtual reality, let's tackle this one first. I call it vomity reality. It really doesn't work for me yet. I've just actually been on a call this morning with one of our graduates who's been trying out a new headset on very high 5G bandwidth. He said the nausea is actually starting to go, which is good news, because I can't use VR at the moment. So instantly you go, okay, if you want to collaborate in VR, we don't want to vomit. So it's not necessarily the best platform to do stuff. So we've actually been taking those baby steps more using augmented reality and mixed reality at the moment. And you can see lots of examples here. some of which we're doing in Belfast, actually. But the first one I want to pick up on is the augmented reality paramedic. He's got an augmented reality headset on that is broadcasting live high definition video back to a remote clinician. He's also got a hybrid glove, a haptic glove on. That haptic glove is connected to a joystick that the clinician has. So literally the clinician nudges the paramedic's hand so that they're in the right place to do a procedure. The idea there is to change the back office, front office dynamic. So enable paramedics to do procedures that they wouldn't be able to do unsupervised otherwise. The notion there is to make sure that we cut down hospital admissions. That's being trialled at the moment in the Midlands. More local to many of you, we're working a lot with Belfast Harbour at the moment. There's a ton of stuff we're doing, one of which is crane inspection using augmented reality. So the crane guy there, augmented reality headset on, he's got a checklist in front of his eyes. He can climb up and down the cranes without having equipment he has to hold. He can bring in a second opinion if he needs it with, again, the camera. We're also tethering drones to him as well, so he doesn't necessarily have to climb right up to the top of the crane. We can send a drone up. So there's a ton of stuff there. There's a lot with remote diagnostic and our engineers as well, using actually literally the customer's camera and the light on their smartphone. We can say, show us what you've got plugged in for broadband diagnostics, and we can use an AI overlay to pattern recognize standard plugs and sockets. For us, that cuts down the need to send an engineer out to go, yes, you've got the wrong thing plugged in, which of course costs money and also time. And for customers, it solves their problem a lot faster. So we get some really good net promoter scores on that. There are a lot of jobs that we might assume could only be done face-to-face or in proximity. But if you've seen any of the EE adverts recently, although those were somewhat simulated, they were real, and we actually proved the technology. So anything from air traffic control to remote robotic hairdressing, that's not one I'm going to opt for at the moment, but there are jobs that even surgery potentially could be done remotely. Then we've been looking at something called an immersive classroom. We've been trialing that in Scotland and Wales, and we've taken that concept, which is there's no glasses involved with that. It turns an entire room into 360-degree interactive space. So we can put kids in bottom of the ocean or in a jungle. We looked at that and thought, well, could we apply that to meetings? So bearing in mind, we forgot people in meetings last week. Could we actually bring them live, full size, around a wall surrounding us so that we cannot forget about them, so that they're very much included in the conversation? And then, given I'm a Star Wars fan, the bit that really excites me, there's a little way out yet, is the next generation of video. It's called volumetric video. It is literally using multiple cameras to capture me in real time. And then you can either squirt me into a metaverse as an avatar, or even more excitingly, as a hologram. So I like to think that in a few years' time, I might be sitting in your lounge, actually, as a hologram, or indeed standing in your office doing this talk, whilst still being in my lounge, to be honest, in my slippers. Though I might not be able to wear my slippers because you'd see them on that particular one. That's the only snag with it. I think the dynamics of a meeting using something like that would change considerably, and we wouldn't necessarily get those proximity biases. But again, we're trying a lot of this stuff out. We're just doing a proof of concept again in Belfast Harbour around those mixed reality meetings. Then finally, I've got to mention AI as well, because everyone does. And actually AI was the hypey thing that was supposed to be the future of work. And the hype died down. And I think the hype's starting to build again, largely because the progress of AI in the past 6 months has been, frankly, quite astonishing. So it is going to play a part. What part is it going to play, though? The big development is generative AI. Generative AI is both weird and interesting. I think if we look at things like Chat GPT, which some of you may well have played with, there's some really interesting stuff there. You can feed it a limited amount of information and it can generate pretty convincing, say, marketing material. In the case here, it's an email. It's a great conversationalist, but it does tend to also spout complete nonsense. So good example here, how many letters are there in the word 19? It thinks there are 9, there aren't. Contradicting it, going, no, there's 12. And oh yes, you're right, there's not 12 either. So count them. So yeah, The problem is the data in the back with a lot of this stuff, and the data in the back isn't always accurate, is not necessarily stable either. So although we've got the kind of front end working pretty well, I think there's still a lot to do with data. And of course, that's very boring data. Actually, I got told off yesterday for calling it boring by a data scientist, and she's right, it's not. But we do need to get the data right in order to get the AI right. So ChatGPT is very interesting. There's also all the image generation using video and all sorts of stuff. There's just a couple of AI generated photos of me placed in art. Now, those are two of the more palatable ones. It's not very good at the average number of fingers for a start. So you can get some very weird hands and teeth. You'll notice my teeth are not in either of those. It can't get teeth very right either. So there's some freaky stuff going on. I think this points towards the fact that even though we've made a lot of progress in the past 6 months, it's still pretty stupid. It's not really artificial intelligence. I keep saying the value of this is putting us with the machine. So actually it's human machine combination, symbiotic AI that's the real value here. And as Albert Einstein says, putting those two combination of that two together could create something pretty remarkable. But I think that's concentrating the mind, and certainly my mind at the moment, around how do we help get humans and machines working better together. That's why we do need psychologists and social scientists working in this area just as much as we need computer scientists and engineers. So are we ever going to get to that 4-hour day? I don't know, but I think there's an opportunity not to just dismiss that and go, okay, that will never happen. It could. There are lots of things that could make it happen. I think the problem we find that actually is technology tends to intensify work rather than necessarily allow us to take more time off. But again, that's a cultural thing. And I think there's a lot of discussion around things like well-being and burnout. Jacinta Ardern being just one very good example of somebody who's had so much juggling to do over the past few years, so many crises to cope with, was brilliant at her job, but has just said there's nothing in the tank. That's a real pity, because she was everyone held her up as one of the best leaders in the world. If one of the best leaders in the world cannot lead anymore, I think we need to rethink the way things work. So I'm going to shut up there. If you are interested, there's tons of research and tons of data behind all this. If you're having trouble sleeping, can probably help. So everything from that balanced communication diet right the way through to that debate around how do we get hybrid to work better, and indeed a whole paper about meetings that I've recently published as well, which I'm always glad to share if you want it. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides. I'm going to stop wittering. I don't know if anyone has any comments or questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That's really interesting, and I would imagine everybody can identify with at least something that's been said there. It all feels very relevant for us at the minute. So just to encourage everybody, as we said, to use the Q&A box to ask your questions. And thanks for everybody that has started to use that. So one's come through, and might be fairly obvious to a room full of accountants that we're thinking about the economic impact of things. But do you think the changes in the economy that we all can see at the minute are going to change the way employers look at hybrid working, or means that employers might change what they offer in terms of a hybrid approach?
Yeah, and I think that's another factor to take into account. So we are LinkedIn did some very good research recently that they published looking at the content of the job adverts that they put out. As I mentioned earlier, if you mention hybrid, you're likely to get more applicants. But they also saw that there were less organizations offering flexible and hybrid roles. So there were less adverts, but when there was an advert that offered flexible or hybrid, they got way oversubscribed. So I think there is a move, certainly, to say, okay, we're not going to offer so much flexibility. I think the problem with that, and the reason why I think we still will see a hybrid world of work, is that number one requirement is flexibility and autonomy, and that's not going to go away. So I think if you want to compete for top talent, you're going to recruit top talent in that way, and everyone is competing for those high level top skills, particularly in areas, those hot areas like data and cyber. And if you offer it to them, you've probably got to offer it to everybody else as well. And certainly if we look at things like pay, again, Nick Bloom's research is showing that people are willing to take an 8% pay cut effectively to be more flexible. I think that the other dynamic to take into account is almost that cost benefit analysis that we're all doing now, to be honest. If we're thinking about going into an office, it's kind of, well, how much is that commute going to cost versus how much is it costing to heat my house all day? And I think people are starting to get very savvy about that, particularly if, you know, if the commute is a lot, if you're commuting into, you know, particularly if you're a London commuter, to be perfectly honest, this was one of the big ones for London, especially. It's very expensive, particularly if you're sort of commuting from the suburbs in at peak. That equation isn't always that convincing. And of course, some people have moved further away from urban locations during the pandemic as well to get bigger housing, to get gardens. So I think there is certainly a debate about both from employers and employees. Of course, the foot is largely, the shoe has been largely on the foot of the employee up till recently because of the skill shortages. It is that dynamic, I think, is starting to shift. If we go into heavy recession, which at the moment, I mean, you're accountants, you probably know more than I do, but it looks as if the prediction is it's not going to be as deep as maybe some people had feared, but who knows? I mean, it might be. But, you know, you always see that inevitable shift, potentially in harder times, that employers can start to dictate it a little bit more. But as I said, I think top talent are still looking for the flexible and hybrid options. And if you want to attract and retain them, that's probably what you're going to have to offer.
That makes sense. Another question is, who should be leading future work strategies?
I mean, the conversations I'm having at the moment, it varies company on company. A lot of them at one point were IT driven. And to be honest, IT have done wonders. I mean, I've worked with a lot of the IT departments during that first stressful couple of weeks of lockdowns, and they managed incredible things in incredibly short periods of time. And they've started to you know, they had sticking plasters, sticking things together, and that's starting to get a lot more robust. So I think actually it's the IT infrastructure now is pretty much there in a lot of companies, and the future work strategies are starting to shift a little bit more to property, who obviously are being very affected by this. And particularly if you've got, like we have, an investment in some brand new offices, or actually in Belfast, it's just been refurbished, our office. That's an expensive refurbishment to have absolutely no one in. So there's a lot of debate from the property area around, well, how do we make it much more attractive? How do we build offices that people want to be in? And then HR are also in there. Again, that recruitment and retention piece, I think, is the big discussion point for them. So I'd say the key stakeholders typically are IT, HR, property, and also internal comms, who obviously are very instrumental in terms of trying to change attitudes and behavior. But I think it has been shifting over the years. And to be honest, I don't think it's kind of got to be a combination of all four of those, rather than necessarily it being an IT led or an HR led. And that's kind of a cop out in terms of who should be leading it. Because I think it should be all of them, because they all have little different jigsaw pieces of the puzzle that they need to be sort of slotting in to make that future of work strategy work.
Okay. I'm going to slightly paraphrase this question, but we need to define the purpose of the meeting and what your own purpose of being there is, but surely communication is the cornerstone to successful business. So, and this is the important part, maybe it's not always about what you can get out of it or contribute, but that's hard to distinguish about when to meet and when to not. So I guess the challenge is, don't be there if you don't feel like you need to be there, but sometimes how do you know that you don't need to be there? Maybe is the question.
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, particularly in the hybrid world, those bigger meetings are very unwieldy and very difficult to manage. And there is certainly, I think, meetings of 6 people and less tend to be far more productive, particularly in the hybrid world, or actually probably in the physical world as well. I think the problem and the temptation is, yes, communication is good. But if you invite the entire world and his wife on every meeting, you would just end up on that death by meeting wheel. So I think it is about thinking, particularly when you're doing synchronous, who needs to be synchronous on this conversation? the beauty of digital, of course, is you can record things. So actually a sort of one-to-one dump, I mean, the sort of senior manager briefings, I keep saying the actual talky bit, the bit I've just done, I could have pre-recorded that and then leapt on at this point to do the Q&A. So you could have watched the recording at any point and just reserved, 20 minutes for a Q&A at the end, which would then be synchronous. So if it's a sort of briefing, think about, you could do this in a slightly different way. Think about who needs to be there. Think about who that contribution is if it is synchronous. Record it so that the people that aren't invited can still catch up and can still contribute asynchronously. So I think there's a lot of things with, the temptation, to be honest, it is very easy to do stuff synchronously, but it is a time vampire. And as I said, that 4-hour day is never going to get achieved if we keep spending 8 hours a day in meetings and then another 4 hours working after that, because we haven't done all of the things that were on our to-do list because we were in meetings all day. And that's not good, because if you look at things like burnouts, it is typically a longer hours, stressful culture. And as I said, the brain isn't built to operate more than 4 hours a day on deep cognitive tasks. So some of those meetings, particularly towards the end of the day on Friday, like now, we're not necessarily paying attention, productive, or even firing on all cylinders. So I think there is a case, particularly for senior leaders, for deep thought. Sometimes, we do need to think about cognitive tasks. We should be maybe stepping back and thinking more about the stuff that we're doing rather than just talking about it in meetings all the time. So yeah, I think it is a difficult one. It is a culture shift. You just need to think about, what's valuable synchronously, what isn't. How do we do this in a slightly different way, and how do we include everybody to make sure absolutely we want to communicate, but how do we get everyone to contribute? Actually, last night I was at having dinner with somebody who was doing some work on autism as well. Synchronous sessions are not good for autistic or neurodiverse people, or even introverts. I'm an introvert, by the way. I don't necessarily verbalize things. I like to think about things. I love chat, actually, in meetings. That's me. I'll be thinking about things for about 10 minutes, and then I'll Google it. I'll find some interesting stuff. I'll post some links. I'll then have a conversation. Everyone else in the synchronous world has moved on at that point. That doesn't make that contribution any less valuable. With neurodiverse people, again, you're probably not going to get them to verbalize. They'll probably want to write something down. They don't like having their video camera on. So chat becomes very much a valuable way of doing things there. So again, they miss out if it's all synchronous and it's all verbalized, because they won't give their opinion.
I guess that culture shift is a little bit trial and error, isn't it? See what works for your organization too. That's
why I said experimentation is key here. I think there's no one answer that's coming out. There's no one way of doing things. There are certainly starting to emerge sort of best practices, things that seem to work. Things like having if you've got a very big hybrid meeting, having an online moderator and a physical moderator actually working together, so that the online person is watching what's those hands up, those questions, those chat sessions, and actually feeding that back into the room so that all of that isn't lost. So that's starting to become fairly normal for larger meetings. But yeah, I think it is a case of trying stuff and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work.
Next question that's come in is, what would be your top piece of advice for managers who are trying to manage with the challenges that come with having staff on varying hybrid arrangements? It's a tricky one. Yeah, that is a tricky one. And I think, so we were, again, having this discussion this week around, okay, it's easy to mandate 3 days a week in the office around that. And I think that's appropriate sometimes. It isn't always, though. The worst case scenario is you bring your people in and they sit for most of the day on video calls. And that's not best use of office time, to be perfectly honest. I think it is difficult, but I do think a lot of this does probably need to be delegated down to managers, because they know their teams best and they know what work's going on. And they know hopefully, the value of bringing people in. I'm in a very, geographically dispersed team. So it's a lot of effort to get all of us together. So we only do it when it's absolutely valuable to do it. And that's around building those relationships or doing complex tasks or very collaborative work. Otherwise,
we can chunter along using both asynchronous and synchronous tools, but my boss knows that, and he understands the team, and he understands what work we're doing, and so he doesn't need us to be in the office every day. For other teams, it's very different. But I think that the thing that we have seen is that managers and team leaders need guidance, they need training. We can't just assume that everyone knows how to do this automatically. It is a skill, and they do need help. So yeah, I think that there's a lot that we need to think about. Even things like, conventional management theory would say leading by walking around is a great way of leading. How do you do that in a hybrid world? So you can lead by zooming around. It's not quite as spontaneous, but and it's I think that one comment about that sort of fully remote world is it's a very formalized world. It's all about appointments in diaries. It is all about meetings, and it's generating more meetings, of course. So it's quite difficult to do, and I think that's why we tended to see with leaders, and certainly senior leaders, where that's very much a contact sport. That is about seeing people, shaking people's hands, going to dinner with people. That's very alien when they're looking at not seeing people, where they're not going to dinner with them, and it's very difficult to build relationships in a digital world. And again, we need to be better at doing that. It's possible to do it. I mean, look at the number of people that have met online and got married. So we know that it's possible to build relationships online. I mean, hopefully they meet each other at some point, but there is a possibility to do that. It's an alien skill, particularly for slightly older senior managers who are used to being in an office and building those traditional relationships. So yeah, I think it's a challenge for leaders, and I can understand completely why senior leaders want people back in the office, because it makes their life a lot more easy. Doesn't necessarily make the employee's life a lot more easy, though.
Yeah, that probably leads us into our next question is there a risk that we all head back to the office just to support presenteeism? And then there's a second half of that question that I don't know if you'll answer, but what is the best hybrid solution in your view?
Yeah, I mean, presenteeism is always a problem. I keep saying seeing people in an office does not mean that they're working, any more than people going, oh, well, they're working from home. But I tried to ring them and they were walking the dog. Again, brain breaks are really important. I think one of the challenges of the hybrid model is that you tend to get a two-speed organization sometimes. So if you're working from an office, it's a very different work pattern to working from home. So if you're in an office, it is usually a traditional 9 to 5, and you kind of, their boundaries. Although, to be honest, those technologies still do tie us back beyond the 9 to 5, to be perfectly honest. So there is an element of you do sometimes work longer, but we did see I mean, home workers do traditionally work longer days, but they work in a more fragmented fashion. A sort of, I guess it's more like digital confetti, I guess. So, you'll work for an hour, you'll take a break, you'll walk the dog, you'll come back, do another hour if you can. I mean, I usually do try and go for a walk every day if I'm working from home. I will be doing that in a minute, actually. But even if I'm on a call, if it's a call with the team, I usually just take the phone out and have a walk and just go, I'm walking, so it's weird. And as I said, it can create that tension around digital presenteeism as well. If you're not in the office, there might be that temptation to work longer and longer and longer and make sure that you respond to everything, because how else can you demonstrate you're productive? I think productivity is a big question. We haven't got time now, but do we measure the right things around productivity? Because again, a lot of those measures were generated back in the industrial age when we were all in factories and we had tangible output and we could measure input and output easily. With knowledge work, when I've done back-to-back calls all morning, was that productive? I'll do a lot of email when I get back from my walk. Again, how do I measure me? And I think that's one problem as we move into that future world of knowledge work. That's probably going to get worse actually with AI, because AI will do all of the quantifiable stuff, the things that are easy to measure. We'll do all the wild, complex and empathetic and caring stuff that we're very good at doing. Machines are not. But by definition, that's probably the stuff that's very hard to measure. And I think there's a big question around, are we measuring the right things in productivity, or are we simply measuring the number of hours that we're working or how long we're sitting at a keyboard? That's not productivity.
Yeah, I'd written down a thought around human nature being that if you're not immediately contactable when you're at home, then somebody assumes they're not working. But if somebody lands at your desk in the office and you're not there, that's okay. So it's sometimes hard.
Yeah. When they come over and you suddenly switch off the shopping that you were doing.
Yeah. Is that more productive? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. In the interest of time, I've got one final question, which maybe would be a nice one to close on. Is there anyone who has got this right yet?
I wish I could say yes. I think there are lots of interesting stuff going on. And as I said, my job is, I'm incredibly lucky because I get to see what pretty much all sectors are doing globally as well. So there's some really inventive stuff going on. But I think the key is the inventive stuff. We're kind of in that mid period of experimentation at the moment, and experiments take a while to bed in. So I think it is a case of watching the space. As I said, there are some best practices starting to emerge. I mean, we can learn a lot from fully remote organizations. I think certainly some of the stuff in the past around how they coordinate, particularly asynchronously, is really interesting. But I don't think there's sort of one company that I go, they are just getting it absolutely 100% right, because I think we're all in experimental mode. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And a nice one to finish on there. So just 2 minutes over, that's not too bad, pretty on time. So I just want to say thank you, first of all, to the people that attended today, and secondly, most importantly, thank you to Dr. Nicola Millard for giving us her time today for such an interesting presentation. As I mentioned at the start, the recording for today's session will be on the Ulster Society website very soon, so you can watch out for that, and also look out for any future events that we have that will come into your email inbox. So once again, thank you for presenting to us today. That was really, really interesting, and thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy your walk with your dog now after a morning full of meetings, and have a good day, everybody.